What's up guys, Top Tier Yugioh here, and if you're looking to improve at Yu-Gi-Oh, this YouTube channel is for you, and understanding the following theory is incredibly important to winning more games, more matches, and ultimately winning more tournaments, and so stick around to learn more about who's the Beatdown. Alright, so who's the Beatdown is all about defining roles within the game. It allows us to decide what each player needs to do in order to win. It streamlines our technical play and can be also applied to deck building, and so understanding this theory is paramount in being able to play at a high level. And so if you want a TLDR or a summary, or just if you don't have enough time to watch this full video because this is probably going to be a long one, skip to the time that's shown on the screen and I have a summary at the end of the video. And so check that out now, watch the full video later if you can't watch the whole thing now. But if you really want to learn more about this theory and become a better player, stick around, grab some food, grab a seat, take some notes, and continue watching this video. And so let's go ahead and get started. Who's the Beatdown was originally an article for Magic the Gathering players written by Mike Flores in 1999. But it has been revisited countless times in other articles, and it's arguably one of the most famous and most referenced Magic articles because of how important it is to not just Magic but any game or card game in general. And so my goal in this video is to relate that theory to Yu-Gi-Oh and display how it allows us to win more games. The amazing thing about Yu-Gi-Oh is how many different cards and decks we have available to us, and it's insane just the sheer number of cards. But what's more interesting is that using this theory, every single deck or strategy at any time or any point within a game can be categorized as one or two things, either a beatdown deck or a control deck. And so the idea behind this theory is being able to determine which roles you and your opponent have so that you can decide the best course of action so that you can defeat your opponent. And so choosing the correct role for yourself or forcing your opponent into the wrong role will make victory very easy for you. And so the first thing we need to do is discuss what these roles are. So, like I said, there are two roles, the beatdown and the control. Basically, the deck that's attempting to end the game as soon as possible is the beatdown deck, and the deck that wants to prolong the game is the control deck. And so don't forget this definition, it's very easy to remember. Beatdown decks want to end the game, control decks want to prolong the game. The control deck is usually said to have inevitability, which means that if the game goes on for long enough, it's inevitable that the control deck will be able to win the duel. Any individual deck will always fall into one of those two categories. You either want to win right now, or you want to win later on at some point in the game. The beatdown deck wins the game because they're able to win before the control deck is able to function efficiently or at its highest capacity, or while its own deck functions at its best in the early game. The control deck is able to win because the beatdown deck has run out of resources, or is unable to function efficiently, or is able to control long enough for its own engine to function at its best. An example of a beatdown deck would be Mermails or Atlanteans, as they strike hard and fast and try to OTK as soon as possible. An example of a control deck would be Paleo, who try to survive the early game so that their deck becomes more efficient in the late game, as when all of their traps become more traps and their monsters become more monsters. So as the game goes on, Paleo gets more efficient, and so they usually want to extend the game, which usually makes them a control deck. And so if I had to graph what a typical beatdown deck looks like, it would be something like this. And so don't roast me for my terrible hand-drawn pictures, but this is what I think a graph of a typical beatdown deck would look like. The x-axis represents time, which in Yu-Gi-Oh we measure in turns, and then the y-axis represents efficiency, which has really arbitrary units, but bear with me. And so as you can see, at turn 0 and for the first couple of turns, it's very efficient, but then as the game goes on, it starts to become less and less efficient. Because of course they're going to start running out of resources. So again, if we go back to our example of Mermails, it's like when you do your combos, you end up using all the Dragoons in your deck, which means you no longer have Dragoons in your deck, so you can't really do the combo again, which means that your deck is less efficient. And so that's why as the game goes on, the deck, can't really function as well as it used to. I think most control decks tend to look like either of these two curves. And so these are two different control decks. The first one, which is the blue curve, is a deck that really starts off kind of slow, but as the game goes on, it gets more and more efficient. So this would be something like Paleo, to where at first, most of your Paleo traps are just 1-for-1s, but then as you get more traps in the graveyard, all of your Paleo traps become +1s because of its own effect and the Paleo that you're bringing back from the graveyard. And then all of your frogs, normally they're just like, you don't gain the advantage, but then as the game goes on, they all become pluses, because as you get more frogs in your graveyard, every swap frog also turns into a Ronin Totem. As you make Totally Awesome, every turn, Totally Awesome turns into that plus another frog that you summon from your deck. And so as you can see, as the game goes on, the deck gets more and more efficient and increases very, very quickly its efficiency. And now the second curve, which is the orange line, represents more of a deck that isn't necessarily doing much more in the late game than it is in the early game, but it is able to get to the late game very easily, and then once it gets there, it can keep on adding on top of that. So it's something like Invoke, to where you're still just going to be normal summoning Alistair and then fusing with it. But as you get to the late game, it becomes a lot easier to do that and a lot easier to add on to that advantage that you're getting from doing that. So really just sort of steamrolls. But the important things to take away from this is just to notice how the control deck usually starts off slow but picks up speed over time and have very strong late games versus the Beatdown deck, which started off very fast but oftentimes gets weaker as the game goes on. And so this is sort of what happens when you put these two curves together. And now I'm actually going to shade in the regions where each deck is most likely to win, just to sort of drive the point home. And so as you can see in the first graph, the red represents the Beatdown deck, the blue represents the control deck. The Beatdown deck is very likely to win during the first couple of turns, but then the blue deck, which is the control, is way more likely to win in the late game, and same in the other curve. And so again, red represents the Beatdown deck, orange represents the control deck. And so in the early game, the Beatdown is very likely to win, but in the late game, the control is very likely to win. And so this is consistent with our definitions for these roles. The Beatdown deck wants to end the game as soon as possible, and the control deck wants to extend the game long enough for it to be able to win. But now the question is, what happens at the midpoint? And now we're going to discuss this very soon, but this is pretty much the midpoint of this video, and so these are the basics that you need to understand the concept. If you're good on these or are already familiar with this concept of who's the Beatdown, I'd suggest checking out the rest of my theory videos in the playlist at the top right corner of the screen, or by checking out the summary at the end of this video, and the time of that will be shown on the screen. But you are going to miss out on some of the applications of who's the Beatdown, and so for the rest of this video, I will be discussing what happens in the mid game, how to determine your role, matchups, and then the 8 core principles of who's the Beatdown, and how this theory can be used to make in-game decisions. So you're missing out on a lot if you leave here. I'd suggest sticking around, but now let's get into the rest of the video. And so again, as a quick refresher, the Beatdown deck wants to end the game as soon as possible, while the control deck wants to extend the game for as long as possible. In the early game, the Beatdown deck is more efficient, and the control deck is more efficient in the late game. But now let's talk about the mid game. And so if you go back to those graphs, the midpoint or the intersection of both those two curves and the surrounding time represents the mid game. And so in the mid game, both decks are functioning moderately, and the game can truly go either way. And this is when the winner of the duel is usually decided, because if the game lasts long enough to go to the late game, the control has a huge advantage. So this is the Beatdown deck's last chance to win the game. And so if the control deck can survive a little bit longer, they'll usually be able to overwhelm the Beatdown deck. So again, this is the point in the game where it becomes very crucial and very important to define your role and correctly know what you need to do. This is the point where most role-based technical play mistakes are made, and the Beatdown player needs to act in favor of damage, not in favor of card advantage or in tempo. It's like when you have game but you don't attack because it might be a mirror force, and then it gives your opponent enough time to mount a comeback and break your board, and then you have no chance to win. Like, it doesn't matter if it's a mirror force anymore, because now you have to answer their board too. And so you have to recognize the clock that your opponent is on to determine how quickly you need to strike and how risky you can afford to be. Contrarily, the control deck also needs to focus on card advantage, not damage, so that they will eventually be able to break down the Beatdown's board and then take control of the game. The exception to this is if your opponent may have an out to your defense, and so let's go back to the Mirror Force example. So if they summon 2 level 4 monsters and attack, you might want to stop that because it may lead to a Tornado Dragon, in which case you would lose that form of defense as well as your life points, thus risking defeat. And so you have to keep that in mind and make reads on your opponent, but ultimately you want to make your plays and your decisions based on card advantage. And so understanding your role within the game is always crucial, but once you're in the mid game, it becomes absolutely critical to your ability to win the game. Next, I want to talk about determining your role. And so up until now, I've spoken in terms of ideals and what would happen in the ideal situation. But real games are unpredictable, things can change very quickly. And so I want to discuss how to determine your role at any individual point in time. The most important part of determining your role is understanding the idea of power versus inevitability. We've mentioned inevitability before, and it refers to the idea that if the game in the current game state continues indefinitely, the control deck will win. It's inevitable that the control will win the long game. Power, however, is essentially its countermeasure, and so power physically is a unit of force per unit time, and so something with a lot of power can exert a lot of force in a very short period of time. In Yu-Gi-Oh, force is analogous to a deck's ceiling and the amount of tempo, and then time is measured in terms. And so a really powerful deck is able to make a lot of plays in a very short amount of time, or usually in a singular turn. And so if you look at spirals, for example, they're very powerful, and they can make very strong boards in a single turn, compared to Paleo, who can make very good boards, but it often takes a long time to do it. Paleo, by this definition, is not a powerful deck. Despite their ability to make strong boards, despite being able to say they have a high ceiling, it's just not powerful. And so just as a general rule of thumb, the more powerful deck will be able to overpower a less powerful deck in the early game, as the less powerful deck takes longer to get to that same point. And how this sounds awfully familiar to the Beatdown deck, doesn't it? Well, that's because powerful decks tend to be Beatdown decks, while decks with inevitability that are usually less powerful tend to be control decks. So let's look at another of my hand-drawn masterpieces. This is power versus inevitability. And so we're going from left to right, and then as the curve gets higher, it represents efficiency once again. And so on the first few turns way to the far on the left, the more powerful deck in the red is favored. As we approach the mid game, neither deck is necessarily favored. That's why they both have a relatively low efficiency. And then as we approach the end game, so as more time passes, the deck with more inevitability, or the control deck, tends to be more efficient. And this is evident right now. Efficiency from both a physical standpoint and in Yu-Gi-Oh! Refers to a loss of power as the process or the duel continues. The more powerful a deck is at the time is the beatdown, and the deck with inevitability is the control. And now if a deck has both of these, it's probably going to be a blowout game, and if you're on the receiving end of that, you should consider if it's even worth playing anymore. Like, go take a break, get some pizza, and get ready for the next round. But like, if your opponent is the beatdown and the control, they're beating you probably. And so a graph of this would look something like this, to where the red line represents both and the purple line represents neither. And as you can see in the early game, the deck that is both the control and the beatdown is winning, and the late game they're still winning. So that's a problem. So to determine your role within the game, you have to ask yourself, which deck is more powerful right now, and then which deck has inevitability right now. Now you will have to ask yourself these questions multiple times throughout the game, because these roles are fluid, they can change throughout a game, and this usually occurs in the mid game, but you'll have to keep asking yourself these questions. And now your opponent can also have an effect on this. And so for example, let's say you want to be the beatdown deck, but your opponent has a lot of defensive cards or hand traps, and they're really stopping you from playing the game the way you want to play it. So they're lowering your ceiling, making you less powerful. And so a beatdown deck will normally look like this, to where in the early game you're very efficient, and then you're dropping off as you get to the late game. Well, now because they're lowering your ceiling, your deck still has the ability to do the same combos or do what it wants to do, but you just can't do it those first few turns, and so your efficiency is a little lower. But as your opponent runs out of defense, then you're able to function optimally and then do the same things that you were doing normally. And so if you compare this to what we said the control deck graph looked like from earlier, you'll see that they're very similar. And so what was considered the beatdown can also become a control deck. So now let's see what happens if this game continues infinitely. And so as always, the red represents the beatdown deck, the orange is the control deck, and then the green represents a role change. And so this is usually when we're in the middle of the mid game. And so in the early game, for the first couple of turns, what we would consider a beatdown deck, their ceiling is being lowered. And so they're actually having to play more like a control deck in this case. And then as we approach the mid game, so when the control deck runs out of defense and the beatdown deck is able to function optimally and do their combos, now their ceiling becomes a lot higher than the control deck, and so they're able to play as a beatdown deck again. And so this is their best chance to win the game. And so as if we even just stop this here, if you're playing a beatdown deck and your opponent they're using hand traps or defense to stop you, as soon as they run out, you usually want to kill them as soon as possible, right? But now if this game continues even further, again your deck becomes less efficient at the end game, and so you start leveling off, your efficiency drops off after a few turns, and then the control deck starts functioning even better, giving them a higher chance of winning in the late game. And so as you can see, these roles change twice. And so in the early game, the red deck has to play more like a control deck. In the mid game, they have to be the beatdown deck, and then in the end, they don't really have a role, they're just losing. And so actually this is an example of one deck having both roles in the late game, because the control deck at this point in the late game is both the beatdown and the control. Their deck is more powerful right now, so they're able to be the beatdown, but they also have inevitability because they're more efficient, which allows them to also be the control. And so at this point in the game, they have a much higher chance of winning than the beatdown deck. And that's why it's so important to win in the mid game in this case. So that's why, again, it's important to recognize your role and to know when you have the best chance of winning the game. So now I hope you can really see how these roles can change within a game, and again, when the roles change is when most players make mistakes, but by recognizing this, you can make the correct plays. And I think the best example of this right now is Spirals. Like, Spirals are an amazingly powerful deck, but hand traps hurt them a lot, and force them to be a control deck in the early game, but eventually, your opponent will run out of hand traps, and the Spiral deck will be able to combo and then become a beatdown deck once again. And so you could say that during the early game, Spirals have the inevitability before comboing, and this really gives the opposing decks two chances to win the game. Before Spirals can combo, so they have to excel at being able to play the beatdown, or after they combo where the Spiral deck is less efficient. which requires them to be a good control deck. Doing anything else will lead to a loss. And so again, timing is key. So if you have hand traps but you can't beat spirals in the early game, eventually they're going to combo off and beat you. But if you have hand traps and can put massive damage on board, something like Trick Stars for example, then you can beat spirals. And now if you can survive the early combos and out their board, and then play efficiency late game, you can also beat spirals because you're a very good control deck. An example of this would be like Burning Abyss right now. And so it's all about recognizing the role that you need to take, and then doing what gives you the highest chance of success. But now let's talk more about control decks. And so before we're talking about the beatdown deck really changing roles, let's talk about how a control deck can change roles. And I think the best example of this is Paleozoics. And so again, a typical control deck or Paleozoics will look something like this. It starts off very slow. As the game progresses, it gets very fast. But then if the game continues infinitely, eventually they also start losing their efficiency. And so although they start slow and have very strong late games, like eventually you run out of resources. Like eventually you run out of rodent totems. Eventually you run out of paleo traps. And so at that point, it becomes very difficult for you to win. And so Paleo usually try to lower their opponent's ceiling while also setting up their own endgame, and then once they get there, they can become the beatdown deck. And so they can oftentimes beat opponents before they're able to play optimally, or if the game persists long enough to do so, it would look something like this. And so Paleo represents the blue, and the red is a normal beatdown deck. And so in the early game, the beatdown deck's ceiling is slightly higher than Paleo, but not still at its full capacity. The Paleo deck's efficiency is relatively low. As we get to the mid game, the Paleo deck becomes more and more efficient, having a very high chance to win while they can both lower the opponent's ceiling and set up their own combos. But then after a while, when the Paleo deck runs out of resources, if the beatdown deck is still in the game, they haven't lost yet, they are able to come back and win the game because they're still the control deck in this case. Because once the Paleo deck starts running low on resources, they lose inevitability and have to become the new beatdown deck. Once this happens, it gives other decks a chance to win. And so that's why Paleo usually have to win before it gets to that point. And so again, timing is so important. You have to recognize your roles, your resources, and know how close you are getting to that point. And so playing a card like Pot of Desires expedites the process and makes you a little bit faster to get to that point in the late game. And now another scenario that affects roles is the clock. And so as I showed before, the scale of power versus inevitability depends on time. And when the round is ending or if players are in time, it's again time to determine what role you want to have. And so are you up on life points? Then you probably have inevitability. If things stay the same, you will win the duel because you have more life points. But you might not. And so things can change if you're not careful. If you're down on life points, but you are more powerful, then you must be the beatdown, the aggressor. You need to be able to break your opponent's defenses and deal damage, after which you can become the control, protect your life points, and then win the game. And so again, every single deck at any point in time will fall into one of these two categories, the beatdown or the control. These roles can change, and you as the player needs to manage the timing and these changes to recognize what you need to do in order to win. What role you play is a lot more than what deck you play, and many factors go into this. You just can't say I'm playing Spiral so I'm a beatdown deck, or I'm playing Paleo so I'm a control deck. You have to look at it on a turn-to-turn basis and determine what role you have right now and to decide what you're going to do right now. Now I want to discuss what you can do once you determine the roles and how you can go about winning games. And so up until now, I focused on situations where each deck was in one role and while the other deck was in the other role. Now we're going to consider situations where both players attempt to play the same role as well as when they play different roles. And so once again, matchups are a comparison of two decks and their interactions with each other. Flores defined the best deck as one who can be both the beatdown and the control deck in the majority of matchups. Contrarily, a bad matchup is when you are unable to confidently and successfully play either role or your desired role. And so an example of this would be Infernoids versus ABC. ABC in normal scenarios has the ability to be a beatdown deck and end the game quickly with Decode Talker, multiple Buster Dragons, Xyz, etc. But it can also be a control deck and use its floaters and the Union Monster's protection effects to survive the early game and then strike hard in the late game. However, when playing against Infernoids, Infernoids can constantly banish the ABC pieces from the graveyard, thus ruining their late game and denying them the ability to play the control. Infernoids can also resolve a single Void Feast and set up multiple negations, preventing ABC from playing aggressively and thus denying them the ability to play the beatdown. So this is a bad matchup for ABC because ABC cannot feasibly play either role. And so if you were to graph their efficiencies, it would look something like this, to where at every single point within the game, Infernoids are more efficient than ABC. And even though Infernoids get more efficient as the game goes on, like eventually you run out of Infernoids in your hand and graveyard, ABC still can't function efficiently because by then, you probably banished all of their A's or B's or something, and so they can't really play either. Another example would be Spirals versus anything else pre-ban list for the opposite reason, being that Spirals can play both roles. And so if you allow Spirals to combo, they would be the beatdown deck. But if you didn't let them combo, they would become the control deck, forcing you to be the beatdown. And so it was near impossible to lower their ceiling and play the beatdown through their hand traps, which eventually allowed them to combo and play the beatdown again. And so a typical Spiral game would look something like this. And so they would start off slow as your opponent had a lot of defense, but then as they ran out, you'd be able to combo off, usually win in the mid game, and then they become less efficient as the game goes on. And so if you compare this to a typical control deck, at least most of the ones available to us at that time, they would be something like this, to where they'd definitely be more efficient in the early game, but not efficient enough to actually win the game. And so like, they would stop Spirals for a couple of turns, do a little bit of damage, but not 8,000 points of damage, so it didn't matter. Because once Spirals were able to combo off, their ceiling was just so high with machine dupes and quick fixes, drones, etc., that they could clear your board and kill you immediately. And so this is an example of how Spirals can play both the control in the early game and then the beatdown in the mid to late game. And so now that we've talked about good and bad matchups where one deck plays both or neither role, let's look at some neutral matchups. And so a neutral matchup is where one or both decks are playing a singular role for most of the game, or when both decks have the opportunity to play both or neither roles. So the first matchup I want to talk about is a beatdown versus beatdown deck. So a general rule of thumb here is that the beatdown deck with a higher ceiling usually wins because they can just kill the opponent through what the opponent does. And so an example of this would be ABC versus Spirals. So if Spiral goes first uninterrupted, they're able to make a board that ABC just can't play through. But if Spirals goes second, they can play through a singular Buster Disruption and then still break ABC's board, and then end on a board that ABC can't play through. And so the deck with the higher ceiling, aka Spirals, tends to win most of those matchups. Now the other rule of thumb is that the more efficient deck can also win. However, the more efficient deck wins when the difference in power isn't high enough, as it will survive the early game and still be able to play longer than the other beatdown deck, and so it can essentially become the control. And so a graph of these efficiencies might look something like this, to where although the purple deck has a lower ceiling for the first couple of turns, after a while, when the beatdown deck drops off a cliff, they're still able to play. And so the more efficient deck can actually choose to play the control, and so even though it's traditionally a beatdown deck, it can choose to play the control, which gives it a higher chance of victory. And again, this is when technical play and deck building matter, because choosing to try and overpower a more powerful deck is suicide. Like, you just won't win. If the less powerful deck and more efficient deck is unable to play the control, however, then it's a bad matchup. So now let's talk about the control versus control deck matchup. The rule of thumb for this is that the deck with a higher late game ceiling will usually win because there will be momentarily a point in time where they can overcome the opponent's defense. An example of this would be True Dracos versus Pendulum, to where Pendulums will win as soon as they can overcome the True Draco deck's defense. And so it's sort of like True Dracos can grind a little bit, they summon a masterpiece, but when Pendulums can beat that masterpiece and then put more things on board, the game usually ends very quickly from there. And so if you remember the graph from earlier where I showed two different control decks, this is really a matchup of that. And so the blue would be sort of like Pendulums, and then the orange would be like True Dracos, to where in the early game True Dracos is really good, while Pendulums are still setting stuff up. But then by the mid game, when Pendulums can do a lot of plays, they can out masterpiece, play through back row, and then set up a board that usually True Dracos can't get through. Now the other thing to remember is that the more efficient deck will also usually win because they will have more resources throughout the mid to late game, and they won't run out of resources. So this forces the less efficient control deck to play the beatdown. If the less efficient control deck cannot play the beatdown, it's considered a bad matchup. And so this is the case of True Dracos versus Paleo, to where Paleo cannot be the beatdown because the small True Dracos will stop Paleo traps from activating, so their deck never gets efficient enough to deal with Masterpiece and win the game. However, they also can't be the control because eventually they run out of resources, and so they will not win the game if it goes indefinitely, versus True Dracos, which have Disciples to keep recycling cards. And so this would be a bad matchup for Paleo once again. And the final matchup is beatdown decks versus control decks. And so this is what we've been talking about for most of this video. And the only thing they remember for this is that timing is incredibly important, because the beatdown deck has a high chance of winning early, but the control deck has advantage in the late game. So the key thing to winning this type of matchup is the timing and technical play in the mid game. In a neutral matchup, the control deck will not win in the early game, and a beatdown deck will not win the late game. Alright, so finally, let's talk about the 8 core principles of who's the beatdown. In 2012, Mike Flores, who wrote the original Who's the Beatdown article, revisited his article and summarized it with 8 key points. These are the 8 core principles of Who's the Beatdown, and so I'm going to cover most of this quickly, but think of this as a review or a summary, or a TLDR for things that you can remember. And so the first point is that there are 2 decks and their positions are fluid. So there are beatdown decks and there are control decks. And there are many different situations where these roles can change, but the important thing is to be able to define your role and then recognize when it is going to change. Number 2, greed versus speed. So this is all about remembering when to time your plays. Choosing a role doesn't mean rushing to do one thing or waiting to do another. You just need to keep your role in mind when planning your plays, and so play around defense effectively and avoid being greedy. Number 3, play differently going first or second. Realize that as a beatdown deck you cannot win the game on turn 0 because you can attack. And then realize as a control deck, you need to have more defense on turn 0 as your opponent will have 6 cards to break your board, and so turns can dictate roles. So keep that in mind when side decking and also when deck building in general. Number 4, inevitability. So go back to this time shown on the video to review the power versus inevitability scale and to learn more about that. But inevitability is very important for determining your role. Number 5, all warfare is based on deception. So this is a quote from The Art of War, which is an ancient Chinese military guide, but realize that the roles are fluid and strike when the opponent thinks you won't and prepare for their own surprise attacks as well. So this becomes extremely important in the mid games where roles are fluid and you can really be in either role, so be careful of your opponent trying to force you into one, or be careful of them setting you up to be one role when it's not what you prefer to be. Number 6, identify position and take action. Once again, determining your role by itself is meaningless if you don't act accordingly. You have to make the correct plays. Number 7, the definition of a bad matchup. And so again, a bad matchup is when one deck is able to have both roles, or when the other deck is unable to have either role. If you want to learn more about matchups, I'd go back to this point in time in the video and just review that part of the video. And then finally, number 8, side accordingly to your intended role. And so beatdown decks should side ways to stop the control deck from lowering their ceilings so that they can win early. And control decks should lower beatdown deck's ceilings so that they can survive long enough to play optimally. And so for example, if you're a beatdown deck, even though you're going first, why would you necessarily side like a Solemn Strike versus a control deck? Because if they're playing control deck on their first turn, their deck's probably not doing that much anyways, therefore you should be siding things that are going to allow you to play on your next turn. So an example of this, if you're playing Spirals versus Paleo, you go first, right? You wouldn't side something like a Solemn Strike because you're not going to need to strike them on their first turn. You just need cards to be able to play on your second turn. So you'd want to side things like Twin Twisters or Zaphion, etc. Those type of cards to deal with their back row and deal with the other cards that are going to stop you from playing. If you're a control deck, for example, if you're going first, you want to side in cards to lower the beatdown deck ceiling. Because again, they're going to have a 6th card, and so you have to be able to deal with that. And so you would side in this case, like strikes or other defensive cards. But if you're a control deck here and going second, then you have to, again, consider the matchup and consider your opponent's deck's efficiency. So if they've already comboed off on their first turn, then you can break their board, in which case their deck will no longer be able to function efficiently, and eventually you can grind them out from there, and so you have to think about siding board wipes possibly. But also you have to consider about them lowering your ceiling, and so you really have to gauge your opponent and determine if they know this theory, or if they really know how they should be siding. So this is very tricky really if you're going second with a control deck, because sometimes it might be better to side like, again, cards to keep your opponent from lowering your ceiling. So finally, I just want to give you guys a few references and readings, and I will put the links to all these in the description, but there's the original article, Who's the Beatdown, written by Mike Flores in 1999. There's Who's the Beatdown number 2, Multitasking, written by, and I hope I pronounced this correctly, Moshevitz. Then there's Revisiting Who's the Beatdown by Chang in 2011. The 8 Principles of Who's the Beatdown, again by Flores in 2012. And then I also think that Patrick Hoban's book, Road to the King, also talks about this very, very well. And so I think all of those are great places to go from here to read more on the theory. I think it's very important. And understanding Who's the Beatdown is, again, very, very important to being able to play the game at a high level. If you can't do that, it's going to cause you to make a lot of misplays, and other players are going to take advantage of that. If you look at any of the game's greats, they know all about this theory, even if not, like, technically, they know it intuitively. And so being able to understand this is also being able to take advantage of your opponents and keep them from taking advantage of you as well. And so I hope that you have enjoyed this video. If you did, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, because if you're willing to improve your game, I'm going to try to give you guys the content to be able to do so. But ultimately, my goal with this channel is to help build a community of good players to where we can all help each other improve, while also providing the content to help us all do so. And the best way to help me do this is to subscribe to the channel, like the videos. That way you're going to be notified when I do upload the next one. And so I'd really appreciate if you did that. Again, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.